Well, uh, thanks everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Australian
Going
Economics
today.
Olympiad,
Yep. That'll be
and
taking soon.
first our first educative seminar of the year, leading into this year's competition. Very excited to be back as your host. My name is Justin Virly, economics teacher from Brisbane, Queensland. And for our first educative seminar, I'd like to welcome back our guest, Cameron Murray. How are you going, Cameron?
Hey, Justin. Hang on. Am I unmuted?
I can hear you.
Great.
I can hear you and
Yeah,
see
I'm great.
everything is fine.
Lovely to be back. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yeah. As usual with tech and these video conferences, there is always a little bit of bugs, so we'll have to operate in a little bit of trust, I suppose.
Yep.
Okay, so let's just get stuck into it. For those who might be new, who haven't participated in the competition before, or viewed any or participated in any of our educative seminars, these are open to all students, not just those who are registered or participating in the Economics Olympiad. It's really meant to be a conversation that is open to be accessed, sorry, by students who are in high school. You're most likely you're 11 and 12, who are extra keen young economists, who are keen in understanding how the world works, and especially keen with the problems or the concerns or the challenges going forward. Like to think with perhaps a little bit of recency bias with the current economic conditions, but I've been teaching economics for quite some time, and there always seems to be some very topical issues at hand. So we won't talk too much about the competition itself, at least not at the beginning. It really is just a chance for our students to have access to an expert in the field or someone whose career is in economics, whether they are a policy analyst or in government or a writer or part of a think tank, um, you know, and all of those sorts of things. So I suppose my guest today is Cameron. My guest today is Cameron Murray. I suppose Cameron, can you open up just by telling us a little bit about yourself, your current work and role as an economist or in economics?
Great. Thanks, Justin, for having me, and thanks everyone for attending. Who am I right now? I guess the title I gave myself was Chief Economist of my one-man think tank called Fresh Economic Thinking, which I started 18 months ago. I've been blogging and writing online for 15 years, probably actually since the financial crisis. So since 2007, 2008. So I've written about 1,000 articles online. And in that time, I was doing a PhD. I'd worked in the government, done many things, and I finally decided that I can full time write. I've built an audience, got two books out. The Great Housing Hijack came out last year, and Red was the outcome of my PhD on grey corruption. So I do a podcast and a weekly sort of deep dive economics article because there are just so many people in so many professions in planning and government in different sort of financial consulting that sort of can improve what they do by having a few economic insights under their belt to keep in mind day to day. So that's what I do now. And I also teach at a business school in Saudi Arabia. So I fly in, fly out, and I teach economics to young Saudi professionals, which is super interesting. The whole economy there is radically changing as we speak. So prices are becoming very important. A lot of stuff wasn't priced. Everything came for free. Now it's privatized and priced. So that's sort of an interesting thing to be part of as well. So that's me.
Fantastic, Cameron. And your PhD was from.
It was from the University of Queensland. So I have an undergraduate degree in property economics from QUT, which is, if anyone's considered a very, I think, good, useful, broad course for understanding property development, valuation, construction management, town planning. So if you want to get into that field in some way, if it really interests you, building apartment towers or subdivisions or building new cities and towns, that was very useful. I wouldn't say it's super challenging because I guess I'm comparing that to a master's degree by research where I published academic papers in that about environmental economics,
Mm.
and a PhD, which obviously leads to a lot of academic papers and a book. But yeah, that degree was a really good broad start, very practical, and I definitely would consider it. So the PhD was at the University of Queensland,
Mm.
that I finished 10 years ago, basically.
Excellent. So, having such a lengthy career and kind of having your hands and your brain sort of wrapped around various economies around the world, internationally at different levels and different sectors, um, could you sort of enlighten us on what some of the most interesting work or specifically the fulfilling projects or experiences you've been a part of? So not necessarily, I mean, we can get to the out of left field, just purely interesting things later, but just the most, I suppose, the work that you're the most proud of, where you've said, okay, this is this piece of research I put together, this writing, whether it's based on
Yeah.
feedback or influence, and like, is there anything that you said, wow, that I'm actually quite proud of myself, or proud of my team, or proud of the work that we've done?
Yeah, I'll give you maybe I'll give you three examples. Good things come in threes.
Yeah.
I may as well start with currently what's happening teaching in Saudi Arabia. This is it's an odd and it's a very small insight, but the power of some really straightforward economic insights. Well, they're not straightforward, actually. Once you learn them, they seem really obvious and you see the economic pattern everywhere. But day to day, it's not obvious. So I taught this MBA class, and one of the students was the head of the Saudi German hospital. And they are a private company, but they are less reliant now on public payments for providing services. And they were pricing some kind of like knee surgery or something like that. And this guy went into a meeting and said, what happened? Did we put the price up or put the price down? And, what was the right thing to do? And people came back and said, yeah, we put the price down. And look, we did more knee surgeries because people could, afford it and bring it forward. And then he said, yeah, but did we make more money? He said, I learned in my MBA class this thing called elasticity. And
Mm.
just because you decrease the price and sell more doesn't mean you make more money. You've got to sell more than the proportion you lose in profit to actually make more money. And he's told me, so the way that course works, you do an intensive class for a week, then they go home for 3 weeks, do their normal life and come back. And he told me he taught everybody else in that meeting elasticity and showed them that they're giving away money by decreasing the price this much.
Mm.
And now you might say, oh, that's a terrible thing to teach them because they're doing fewer knee surgeries at higher prices. But I think, there's an obligation within any organizational business also to maximize what you're doing as well. And of course, the more profit they make, the more hospitals they can build, etc. So it's not like what we call there are general equilibrium effects here. So I just thought, isn't that an amazing application of this insight that this student learned in economics one week, applied it to what is a very big, important organization the next week, and in the process taught a handful of other senior people to be more thoughtful about pricing and the sensitivity of their customers to prices. So I thought that was quite a fulfilling little example. It's a small one, but I thought it was very interesting. So I said there were three, right? So I'll quickly tick off a couple. Another one, in my PhD, I ended up writing a book called Rigged that was about my work on grey corruption. And that led to a lot of sort of contribution to forming and improving anti-corruption commissions and things like that. And in that process, it was quite fulfilling to see when I would attend as part of a hearing or an expert panel, communicating the economics that corruption is not just doing the wrong thing, that there are underlying economic incentives, there are group behaviors, there's dynamic elements to it. And seeing these lawyers sort of take that on board and integrate it into their thinking of corruption, because the legal sort of conceptualization of it is very much there's a rule and you didn't follow the rule, therefore that's corruption, sort of. Whereas the economic way is, well, what's the incentive and what's the cost of this choice versus a different choice? So that was, I thought pretty satisfying to be able to sort of elevate the general economic literacy in essentially the legal profession or the anti-corruption industry. And I guess the last one, prior to my PhD, I worked for the Queensland government in water planning. So maybe some of the listeners, the students, have studied common pool resource problems. Right? They're essentially, everyone has access to a piece of land or a fishery or an ocean or some water. And without some rules that we all agree on, everyone will just extract the most value as quickly as they can before the next person and catch all the fish and there'll be none left. So in the Queensland government, I was part of managing the agricultural use of groundwater in the Condamine alluvium groundwater deposit. And what was interesting there is that a lot of people in the department had sort of felt it was their obligation to fix the problem, and they didn't quite see it as a common pool resource problem, where actually it's in the farmers' interest to solve the problem because they're the only ones who access that resource.
Yeah.
Like, it's not us versus them, it's they. We are helping them to solve the problem for the long term. But there was this underlying incentive that if the government did nothing, the farmers would solve it themselves. They would get together, they would bargain with each other. But because the government sort of creates this interesting dynamic where if the farmers say it's bad for them, the government will give them something for free, they sort of change the terms of the debate. And I was able to shift it back through many meetings and tell the farmers, hey, whose interest is it here to solve this problem? It's not mine. Right? It looks to me like your interest, yet you want money for us to help you solve this problem. Why? And I was able to sort of share that economic insight in our department and with that group to change it from this adversarial setting of we need money for you to change any rules to, hey, it's in your interest to change the rules, not ours. You come and ask us and we will help you. And we're not going to pay you money to help you solve this. And so that just sort of totally changed what was a bit of a political stalemate. It was quite satisfying to be able to inject a little bit of economic sense into this situation. And, I'm a big fan of elevating the discussion and enhancing economic understanding, not just for economists, but in lots of these types of political and bureaucratic decision-making processes.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's one of the things that that is most fundamental into why I love teaching economics, is that it sort of in my opinion, of course, it brings together the idea that everybody in a society is connected, that we all have to share, for lack of a better word, the resources that are available. And there isn't enough for everybody to have, I suppose it's more philosophical, the unlimited wants with our limited resources. I'm reading something at the moment that it is top of mind because I'm reading it at this very moment, but it sort of touches on what you were talking about with the markets and how the markets sort of interact with different stakeholders. And there's one small chapter which I'd love to get your insight probably down the track, a little bit later, because it is about housing, and I'm sure that's and it focuses mainly on the problems in building the supply of housing in the United States and the bureaucracies involved because of political or economic policy that has sort of meant well and with strong intentions, but over the last 30 or 50 or 60 years since the 70s have meant more bureaucracy and more safety checks, more environmental checks, the needs for more consulting, which has just meant that it's, depending on where you stand on the issue, it's just as easy to block a coal mine as it is to block social housing or affordable housing, because they're subject to the same checks. And it raised an interesting anecdote of, I think, the I-95 highway in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, somewhere in Pennsylvania, that had some sort of catastrophe. I think it was destroyed effectively, like a section of it was destroyed. A bridge was destroyed. I don't remember what happened. Hit it. Yeah, that's it. It was only
Yeah.
recently,
Yep.
and they rebuilt because it's such a fundamental part of us of Americans' transport and shipping. The governor was able to fast track and rebuild, I think, rebuild the bridge in just a few weeks. I think it was less than
Yep.
a couple of, and so, but that meant that they needed to outright say, okay, we're not going to have as many consultancy firms plan this. We're not going to have
Yeah.
three different environmental audits. We're not going to have four different quotes and shop around, because the priority in this instance is to build the bridge.
Yeah.
Where in other instances where maybe it might not be an emergency, or whether it's an emergency is subjective, things can often get bogged down. And so
Yep.
it raised that idea of, that's why housing supply is such a constraint, is that it's so difficult for houses to be built, at least in the United States context, because of how difficult it is to get all of the clearances and open up parcels of land and all of that sort of stuff. It was a really interesting, all of those audits are probably there for good reason.
Yeah.
The environment, workplace health and safety, preventing corruption and things like that. But when we have a housing crisis and there aren't enough houses being built, it raises an interesting point as to how you can speed things up.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond to that? Because I could talk for hours.
Yeah, we'll table that. We'll table that because I'm sure
Was that
naturally
book
housing will. Yeah, I'm sure
was
housing
that
will
book
come up.
called Abundance by any
It
chance? Is
That's
that
exactly it. That's exactly it. It seems to be a book of the moment amongst economists. So,
Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah, because it
I
only
got
just
some
yeah,
reactions to that
yeah,
because I'm
yeah.
pretty familiar with a
I
lot of
promise
that.
we'll leave room for
But
your insights and for your
great.
responses. Just for the students, though, can we sort of backtrack a little bit? Can you kind of
Yep.
describe yourself a little bit, your younger self, in high school
Yep.
or university or whenever it was that you sort of realized that you have a special interest in economics, or even a special set of
Yep.
skills and knowledge, that this was a career path for you?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't even know what economics was until I was about 22. So uh, in high
Yeah.
school, yeah, I was interested in making money. I had a job from grade 10 onwards at Big W and then at 7-Eleven. And, I was interested in making money, investing, and all the trade-offs I would make
Mm,
about should I do the night shift for the extra money. Didn't really know what economics was. I was more into engineering. I was a real sort of maths nerd, spatial reasoning person. So I started a degree in aerospace avionics after high school because I just thought I'll do the hardest one that I can get
mm,
into.
yeah.
Why not? And did that for a year. I did very well in it and ended up sort of needing to see the world a little. I felt like, yeah, I
Mm,
can solve lots of problems and, calculate the resistance of a circuit really well and all this sort of stuff. But I'm like, I want to go paddle down the Amazon River or something. I feel
mm,
like I could just do anything. And I think young guys in their teens and 20s do need to challenge themselves
mm,
because they can. Like when you're young, you've got the energy, you're fit, you're alert, your brain is really spongy and ready to learn new things. So I went to Canada and skied and worked the summer in construction and traveled the world a bit and came back sort of with a different view on life. Wasn't really keen to just knuckle down. I thought, oh, do I want to be an engineer like these guys? Like I like what they're doing, but I'm actually interested in making money an easy way. So I
mm,
actually tried selling real estate for a while. This was in 2003 when, maybe even 2002 when there was a big boom. If you don't know, you probably
yep.
weren't born there then. But there was a huge real estate boom like there was a couple of years ago, and real estate agents made easy money. So I tried that, and I realized that that's actually not the people making money. They get their commission, but they're not the thinkers who consider how to use property and maximize its potential and what sort of projects are good. So ended up realizing I'm interested in property, but I need to be more, there's more to it than this. So I did this property economics degree after that, which was, a really good introduction, and worked for a couple of property developers. Um, Got a bit frustrated with them, went back and did a research master's degree, which was about, is all this sort of environmental conservation stuff and low energy light bulbs, does it actually work? Does it do anything? And I was just curious about the question. And this is what happened. Didn't know it was economics, went
Mm,
around the university and knocked on doors of professors and said, hey, what's the deal with this? I'm really interested in it. How do I like spend time researching this?
yeah.
And I went to a few people I knew from the property economics course, and they said, "Go and see this guy Tim Robinson, who's the head of school in economics." I made an appointment, knocked on his door, and his PA made us an appointment. But yeah, I went back, and he said, that's a good question. There are people in this department who are interested. If he saw my grades and what I've been up to, and my sort of, I guess, assertiveness. And he's like, yeah, if you can, prepare a research proposal, I'll show you how to apply for a scholarship. And yeah, you can spend the next 18 months with some supervision trying to solve that question, because that is an important economic question. And so he got me into it. And that experience really led me into getting into economics, just
Mm,
reading Jevons and all the old timers, getting into William Bemol and those
mm,
classic Stiglitz, all these old timers. I
mm,
read everything, um, and I did this degree, and I was just like, wow, following your curiosity to
mm,
say. Because people assume stuff. This is what I've learned these days. People go, "Oh, that's not good for the environment, or that's not good for this, or you should do this." I'm
mm.
like, how do you know?
Yeah,
Honestly, because I spent 2 years studying just one of these questions,
yeah,
and I'm pretty sure it doesn't do anything.
yeah, yeah,
And you're so confident in all these things that you're lobbying governments to change their policy, and we don't even know. So there's this
yeah.
huge human temptation to feel good about a behavior,
Mm,
conclude that it must be good, and not do the work to actually understand if it's the right thing. And economics forces you to go, hey, what's the actual outcome
yeah,
first before we go arguing with each other about it? And I find that that's been a real sort of, I don't know, people get annoyed with me because they always go, oh, yeah, we should all do this, right? The
mm,
latest fad, it's a good thing. I'm like, should
yeah,
we? I don't know.
yeah,
Tell me. And they get
exactly.
annoyed, which is, you know, they don't always get annoyed. I've learned to say it in a really nice way and say, yeah, that's, there's probably a lot to that question. We should look into it.
Yeah,
Anyway, so I'm rambling now, but it was not, in high school, I loved supply and demand and calculating the surplus and
mm,
all this. I actually think sometimes we teach in an inaccessible way in economics. And one of my
mm,
projects the next couple of years is to write a new textbook, because everyone gets to that point in their career where they think
yeah,
they can teach it better and write a new textbook, and that's where
yeah,
I'm at. But
yeah,
you know, I think there are more interesting ways to learn about economics and learn how to answer those questions
mm,
without getting stuck on, oh, demand slopes down because of this and supply curves slope up because of
yeah,
this. Honestly, no one knows why a supply curve looks like anything. It's a completely unanswered question,
mm,
but in the textbooks, it's there. And we've got all these hidden assumptions about what's the short run, what's the long run.
mm,
We're just assuming away time here.
yeah,
What's a fixed cost? Why don't we care about the rate of return on variable costs, but only fixed cost? I don't know.
yeah,
Anyway, so I've written a few papers about that. But um, if you can sort of get over that hurdle, digest some of the lingo, it opens the door to such
yeah,
a huge and interesting array of social questions that now I'm like obsessed.
yeah.
Now
No,
anyway, that's my
I can
story.
completely relate and understand. At least in my classrooms and in many of our economics classrooms, I sort of fundamentally, yeah, believe that the way that you engage students and you teach them economics properly is to really flog the real world application. That it is, that this is where they're learning specifically about how the world works and all of its nuances, and that there's a few sort of slogans that many of us will have in our in our classrooms, in the strong and good economics classrooms, that there's no such thing as a perfect policy.
Yeah.
There's always going to be pros and cons or trade-offs.
Yeah.
And kind of everybody hates talking to economics. Everybody hates talking to economists because we're always the first ones to say, well, hold on. Well, what about that? Sure, that would be sure that's a great
Yeah.
idea, but did you think about this group? That group might be negatively impacted, or what is this going to mean 5 years from now? There's always not a point of contention, but just that reality of there isn't a perfect policy, and there's always going to be these trade-offs with any sort of decision that we make, and that's why the world is so complex. I don't want to say difficult, but complex. And I find that,
Yeah.
when we're talking to high school students who love the subject and who have a terrific teacher, like I'm sure all of the students who are interested in doing this, the Economics Olympiad, they love it because they feel like they're learning about the real actual world. And that might even be if they have no intention of following economics as a career. They might be on the path of engineering or
Yeah.
med, but they'll understand. They feel that they'll be grateful that they studied economics because they'll understand who which political party aligns more with their values, or what they want out of their kids' school, or their
Yeah.
local community and local parks, their view on technology, all of that sort of stuff. It is definitely the real world.
I agree. I mean, medicine's actually the ultimate example of trade-offs, right?
Hmm.
Everything you do, there's a trade-off. Do I treat you with this thing with potential large costs? It's an
Hmm.
investment. Do we
Yep.
invest in this treatment, but these are the risks? Or do we delay it because there's an optimal delay as well? Or do we do this? And then you've got health policy, like should I, cure a 5-year-old or an 85-year-old for
Hmm.
the same price? Well, if there are scarce resources, I'm going to go with the 5-year-old because they got 80 years to live. These are clear and obvious economic questions, but you do need a little bit of focused training in
Hmm.
economics to get you over that hump into thinking
Yes.
like that. And it's a little bit hard, and some people just don't like it. They
Hmm.
want the answer. I
Yep.
have a lot of students tell me, yeah, but what's the right thing to do? I'm like, there's no right thing. There are only trade-offs. That's if
Yep.
you leave this class
Yep.
and you tell people there's no right answer, there are just trade-offs. Now let's dig in. What are they? What's going to
Yep.
happen to this group when this happens? Then this, we put the price up here, we build this hospital here, we expand into this market. You know, I, I totally agree with you. But yeah, there is a sort of intellectual hurdle to get over to
Hmm.
appreciate that complexity, as you say, and
Yeah.
that's why human society hasn't solved everything yet. If there
Yep.
was an answer, we'd just be working towards that one answer
Yep.
for two
Yeah,
thousand
that
years.
is yeah, that is the dilemma of the economist, having to just understanding the nuance so well, that having to take ownership of the consequences of understanding that there's no perfect policy. So if you're going to say we should build this here, the economist is the one who understands that there are going to be negative impacts of that, but
Yeah,
still, on balance, they believe it's the most appropriate source of action of the time, and they're ready for the negative. Ideally,
yeah,
in a perfect world, they're ready for the negative
yeah,
consequences, or they're ready for the as opposed to discrediting the negative consequences, or making it seem like the negative consequences are not important, or
yeah.
things like that.
People don't like that. They go, yeah,
Mm,
but this is a bad thing, right? And we go, yes, we're going to take that bad thing because we think the good thing's worth more. Do you agree or
mm,
not? And you got to
yeah.
force people to do that because, as you say, that book abundance and all these sort
Mm,
of regulatory barriers and saving the habitat of this bird, you're like, well, how much is this piece of habitat worth? And can we plant
mm,
the trees they live in somewhere else?
mm,
What's
yeah.
stopping that? So the economist is very open to all these trade-offs and seeing what works, whereas some people get bogged down and go, this is a negative, you can't do anything with that comes with a negative. And I think
Yeah.
that's wrong, but it's sort of a mature way to talk about things.
Mm, yeah.
But it is difficult.
Yeah. I think the next question that I did have written down was, can you describe a little bit about, oh, sorry, what are some of the most fascinating economics topics or events that you follow that may or may not be exactly related to your career? I have a feeling we've already sort of touched on that, or perhaps your career is so broad that there aren't too many things that you haven't worked into your writing. But is there anything that you're like, gosh, this is fascinating? In an alternate reality, I wish I could pull on that thread a little bit more, but I
Hmm.
have too many commitments going on at the moment.
Look, yeah, I think because now I get to write about whatever interests
Yeah.
me, I can incorporate lots of things, even if I don't, I can almost write to learn. And
Mm,
this is another thing I've realized. I can't learn unless I'm trying to explain it in my writing to someone.
yeah.
So if I've got a topic and I want to, it's sort of in the abstract, it fits in my head. If I can't explain it to someone, I don't really know it. So
Mm,
I actually use my writing to go, all right, I'm learning about this topic. And I start writing like, what do I need to know to explain it to someone else? Because I should go find that out. So speaking of the regulations, one of the regulations in property is for rubbish collection. And I know it's kind of boring, but if you have a narrow site and you want to build an apartment building, you're obliged to have enough room on the ground floor for a rubbish truck to pull off the road, get the bins, turn around, and come out facing forwards. On a narrow site, that can mean that your whole building is essentially a rubbish. Like there's no nice front door or anything. It's literally a driveway full of rubbish bins. And that's I'm writing an article about that, and I'm trying to process why that rule looks like that, what its costs are, who's considered changing it, and what barriers they faced. And by giving myself a writing deadline, it's sort of forcing me to go and dig into that, call the council, email these people. That's another thing. When you want to do research in economics, a lot of people are tempted to just, oh, where do I download the data on this? I'm like, yeah, there's only data exists if someone's asked the exact same question before. And if you're not asking the exact same question before, you're going to have to do a bit of legwork. And
mm,
the telephone, I know my generation would just pick up the phone and call people, but it's pretty powerful still, for just getting some insight, finding that key person who knows some history, just to give you a head start in understanding things. So that's what I'm doing with my rubbish truck. I've talked to people in the ACT. They're doing a review of rubbish truck requirements. Would you believe? Things like
mm,
that. Um, so that's a bit of a niche one. Is it fascinating? I think so, because it's boring. People are attracted to high level things like what's Trump
mm,
doing? What's the prime minister
mm,
doing? And they miss the fact that a lot of consequential policy decisions, rules, taxes, fees, payments are not interesting politically and are never discussed. They happen on an industry by industry sort of negotiation, which with a regulator. And there's so many interesting things there that don't get discussed um, at all. Like the supermarket inquiry? I don't know if anyone realizes every 10
mm,
years, Australia decides the supermarkets should put their prices down and they're ripping us all off. It's just like clockwork every 10 years, which makes me think, it's just the normal macroeconomic cycle, right? And it's
mm,
a feel good political response to look like you're doing something. But the more interesting thing that comes out of that is, when Woolworths will buy lots of sites around its own shop so that Aldi and Coles can't set up a shop
yeah.
across the road or next door.
Yeah.
And that is where the interesting part is. And you're like, well, how do you deal with that? Do
Yeah.
we want to regulate who can buy and sell property, or do we not
Mm,
want to?
yeah.
Right? Like, we kind of believe that buying and selling, that's what gets the right people to buy property. But now
Yeah.
we changed our mind and we don't think that. Well, who gets to decide?
Yep.
How are we going to decide where Coles or Woolworths can buy real estate?
Yeah.
That's a really hard question. And then you've got the planning questions like, well, why are there rules on how big a supermarket has to be, or what zoning has to be, and how
Yeah.
a car park, like, do they still apply? Um, there's an interesting case. A friend of mine's a property developer, and they had the owner of a competing retail center, take them to court over their planning application to have a Coles down the road.
Mm,
Why? Well, okay, so our courts should be allowed to do that, but what rule could you change to avoid these commercial,
yeah.
anti-competitive commercial litigations? I don't know. That's a hard
Yeah.
question.
That is, I
And
was just thinking, imagine being the developer or, Westfield or what, or whoever is the owner at the top of planning a shopping center. And if a major grocery store chain or department store says of course, your shopping center would be better off if we had space there, but we're not going to set up shop there unless you promise to keep these other shops out. And
Yeah.
that would be a difficult thing that would, anyone should be able to understand why that would be a difficult thing to say no to.
Well,
Um,
that's actually how it used to work. So I
mm,
think it was the 2000 between pre-financial crisis. So it was between 2005 and 2008. There was an inquiry into supermarkets, and those type of contractual clauses were sort of rendered sort of illegal as a result of that inquiry. So what you used to do is you'd get a Coles if you want to build a shopping center, and that'd be your anchor tenant. You give them a sweet deal, but they would only sign up if you didn't put another supermarket in your building, right? And which is just a free private negotiation. So economists should be like, okay, so our sort of gut instinct should be that that's okay, as an initial consideration. But yeah, those sort of there's a term, but they were essentially banned, which is why
mm,
you get Aldi's, Coles, and Woolworths in the same shopping center now. But you didn't get it sort of in the late 90s as
mm,
much, because these were more common, at least for the first 20-year lease of the anchor
mm,
tenant.
yeah,
Anyway, that's one of those fascinating topics that may or
yeah,
may not be
brilliant,
that fascinating to some people.
brilliant. Well, I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of people, especially our audience here. Speaking of our audience, do you have any advice to high school students who are considering a career in economics? And look, they might be very bright across the board in year 11 and 12, and they could possibly succeed and love learning, so they probably enjoy learning chemistry as much as they enjoy economics class.
Mm,
So, how would they know? How would they know? What about themselves might tell them that okay, is probably where you'll feel at home in. You could do everything, you would be successful in various fields, but how would they know that they should strongly consider a career in economics?
yeah. Good question. And I don't know how you'd know unless you're just genuinely interested in that. Like,
Mm,
yeah, if if it genuinely interests you, like, why is society organized this way?
mm,
Right. And I was going to mention superannuation before of one of those fascinating topics, but
mm,
what is it good or bad that young people should have less money when they're young and more money when they're old? Like, why is it good? Why is it bad? Why does this exist? Where is my money going?
mm-hmm,
Right? Like, if you're really interested, like, why is it that if I'm a family of four and I earn $40,000 and go get a pay rise and now I earn 60,000, I actually don't have any more money to spend.
mm,
That is a real situation that happens because the effective marginal tax rate is so high in
mm,
certain household structures. Like, if that stuff bugs you, if it
yeah,
frustrates you and you don't understand why, like, stupid rules in the
yeah,
world, they're all there for a reason, and there's generally an economic one,
mm,
right? And it might seem tempting. Oh, wouldn't it be great if just everyone did the right thing? Look, people don't do that. Like,
yeah,
the society evolves, rules evolve. You've got to be genuinely curious about that. Um, and I think if you really are, have these questions, then economics is for you. I think if
yeah,
you're just good at numbers, maybe not. You just got to, if
yeah,
that's really interesting, if you go, I can never see myself in a lab, operating a machine to fill beakers with,
mm,
mice enzymes or whatever. If you can't see yourself doing that, and you're really curious about why the world works how it is,
yeah,
then economics, it's a very broad field. You can get into property, you can get into
yeah,
finance, get into macroeconomic questions. Why are poor countries poor? Why are rich countries rich? Is Donald
yeah,
Trump insane? But if China had tariffs, what about America? Like, if that really keeps you up at night, like, I don't get it. Why would
yeah,
that be the case? Get into economics. It's a broad field. There's lots of, people who've considered these things for decades, and you can learn from them and then contribute some
yeah.
insights as well,
That's a
for
great,
sure.
yeah, that's a great response to the idea that if you need to know more, or maybe not, maybe literally or just metaphorically, but if it keeps you up at night. I was having a chat with one of my former students who graduated a little while ago, and they emailed, of course, to just ask me how I'm going, but also what my thoughts were in what the share market's been doing and the
Mm.
tariffs, and just an alumni is, sir, just wondering what your thoughts are. And after our responses and a little bit of back and forth, I asked them a question that I tend to ask alumni pretty often is not just you, but how are your peers feeling about what's going on in economics in the economy? Like how are
Mm.
the 19-year-olds or the 22-year-olds?
Yeah.
Are they all disenfranchised and worried? Are they rallying to change things? Are they optimistic somehow? You know, what's the pulse of you and your friendship group? And I think the student said, to be honest, we're not really talking about the impacts. We're just wondering when we should buy some more shares. And
Yeah.
I thought to myself that I thought to myself, yep, if that's probably it's a perfectly reasonable response, but that probably is an indication that student I don't think that student is studying economics, and but because I would think that if it was just a matter of, oh, I'm not actually too interested in what's going on, I just want to work out when to purchase or when to, you know, maybe finance, or maybe something
Yeah.
unrelated altogether.
Yeah.
But there'd be a lot of students out there who, like, this is really an exciting time for them, for lack of a better phrase, and they want to understand
Hmm.
the ins and outs and beyond their own individual impact or their own
Yeah.
personal, how they themselves are impacted. They really want to understand it. So if you're out there and you feel like what's going on is a thing that you just really want to be involved in and understand, then that's probably a signal of maybe an economics pathway or degree is right for you.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you an example of that curiosity. During my PhD, I was mostly looking at corruption, but um, you know, I was in, my background was in property, so there was this talk about all these regulations in the way, as you said, to housing, and I knocked on the doors and I said, why do houses not get built? Right.
Mm,
And I knocked on all the doors in the economics department at the University of Queensland. I said, I know, because back when I worked in the government, that all that land was rezoned for apartments, but there's like one apartment building.
mm,
But you can build 10,000 there. Why is there only one and not 10, one building and not
mm,
10,000 apartments? And and I knocked on the next door and they go, oh, it must be a regulatory barrier, this and this. And I'm like, I'm sure it's not because I literally know the rules for this.
yeah.
I'm intimately familiar with it. And actually, it took me until one of the last doorways. John Foster was a professor, he's retired now. And he said, that's a good question. There's a group of economists, Dixit and Pindick are two main guys. In the 1980s, they asked that exact same question, would you believe? And they wrote a book called, I think it's called The Analysis of Investment Decisions with Real Options. And he said, go and read that book. And that's where you should start. And you know, I had that question and I just wanted to know. And
Mm,
eventually I found that, yeah, there are one out of this broad church of economists, some people really also wanted to know the answer to that question as well. So that sort of took me down that path. And now I would say I've contributed as well to both my book and academic papers
mm.
building on that. So yeah, that's an example of just being curious and being
Brilliant.
like, I won't stop till I work out the answer to my question.
Brilliant. And that probably would be the best way to transition back into and perhaps our final question or a couple of questions, and of course, without getting too wrapped up in politics and all of that sort of
Mm.
stuff, what are your thoughts on and or views on currently what's going on in Australian economics and the global economy? Of course, the door is open to talk about trade policy and tariffs, but we could start with housing since we've alluded to that before.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps with your thoughts on at least the American context of the supply issue as was raised there.
Yeah, yeah. So where should I start? I think it's important if you're going to talk about housing in 2025 to realize that um, back in 2016 to 2020, all the headlines in Australia were things like double whammy for investors, rents and prices both falling.
Mm,
We forget, in fact, we forget that the rents in Sydney in 2022 were still not as high as they were in 2015 in nominal terms,
mm,
right? Rent was a drag on CPI for half a
mm,
decade. We just forget it.
Yeah.
And then what we had is we had COVID. Everyone decided, the way to treat a respiratory virus is to reduce the interest rate so people can borrow more money to buy houses. I thought that was a silly decision, but in a way, Australia's tied to the global financial markets, and if everyone else is doing it, we kind of have to do it too. So you can't just sort of say what's wrong with housing today without a bit of like thinking of the history. In the US case, the financial crisis and the huge contraction in home building. And in Australia, the huge 2010s home building surge, the depressed rents for housing, and then the COVID era intentional stimulus to make the price of houses go up. And what we've done then is we've gone, whoops, we made the price of houses go up. Let's just make the cost of mortgages go up now. So put the interest rate up. And this is it's a classic economic problem, right? If we could manage the economy perfectly, we wouldn't need prices, but we do, because even the Reserve Bank, the central banks around the world, they're trying to sort of tame this beast, this sort of living being that is our economy. And so they've made mortgages expensive. So at the prices we were at, houses became expensive. So I think that's good context to have in mind. And I think it's important to look past the media headlines. So I actually get calls from journalists nearly every day asking about the housing market. And I always they go, what's your opinion on the housing crisis? And I will say, define housing crisis. Like, you can't just say words. Are rents too high relative to what? Like, we've just had a lot of inflation. Well, why should rents not also go up with the general rise of inflation, right? Tell me. Oh, but what about so the asset price of housing? You're telling us the asset market is mispriced, like the share market might be mispriced. What do you want me to do about that, right? Don't buy a house right now. If you think Apple shares are too expensive or BHP shares or Commonwealth Bank, don't buy them. Like, that's what corrects mispricing in asset markets. So there's a lot of, to get back to a little bit of the general economics of groups, there is an incentive to create problems that aren't really there for your own interest. Every lobby group calls something a crisis because when there's a crisis, maybe you'll get a political reaction. If there's no crisis, what politician's going to push hard for a policy that helps you? No one. So they need a cover story. In my book, I call it the myth, right? You need a story of why doing what's right for me, making me money, is good for everyone. So we've got to create a crisis. And I think the housing crisis has reached that point. Like, yes, there was a rapid rise in rents. But remember, we've had the fewest people per dwelling and the most dwellings in the history of Australia just 18 months ago.
Yeah.
So the houses were bigger, they were better, there were more of them per person than any point in human history.
Yeah.
And yet we're still complaining. Well, that's because we're rich and we keep outbidding each other to move into a better house. It's almost, you can rephrase houses are really expensive as everybody's really rich. Okay, so that's a crisis.
Right? Except for obviously the people who are struggling to get into the market. Of course.
Yeah, but everyone knows you go to a barbecue, your friends who haven't bought a house complain about the price of housing. Then the next barbecue, they've bought one. They're like, how much do you think my suburb's going to go up in value, right? So they, new home buyers want prices.
The funny part of being an economist is that there's such a lot of rhetoric about wanting houses to become more affordable without house prices going down.
Yeah. So I call this the symmetry of property markets, right? Like, those who own want prices and rents to go up, those who don't want them to come down until such time as they own, and which time so they change teams, right? So this is why politically nothing happens, right? And so, obviously I have a whole book about this, but to your point about the regulations, look, I don't think that's why houses are expensive, because if you look in the US, right, these same regulations applied pre-financial crisis in the 2000s boom, and 3 or 4 times more houses were being built back then. Same in the UK, same in Ireland, same in Spain. So there's some kind of new financial constraint in the market post-financial crisis where you can get the same rate of increase in the asset price of homes with fewer new homes being built out of that pool of feasible sites in the market. And that was my question at UQ. Why are all these feasible sites not being built? Well, economics says you do things when the benefit exceeds the cost. You know what is a good thing, a thing that gives you a benefit? Owning a feasible site for housing and not building houses and waiting. And because, it's a little bit of a subtle point, and I'll probably write it on my, on Fresh Economic Thinking, my one-man think tank soon, but land is a leveraged option on the price of housing. So when the price of housing goes up, owning that, just like a financial option, makes you money while you wait without having to build anything. So I think as a cause of high housing prices, I think the regulatory story is essentially wrong. Yes, you can regulate where houses go without affecting how many, right? Because you can, just like we can regulate, you must drive on the left side of the road. Oh no, we've got half as many roads to drive on because we can only drive on one half in one direction. No, that's a location restriction. It's solving a coordination problem. Yes, you can't build what you want right here, but there are many other places you can build it and it's feasible. We're regulating locations. And I think that's a useful regulation to do. And I think most people are comfortable with those location regulations. And we have them for good reason. If you read about the 1930s depression in Australia, right, there's a book called, here's one for the Australian housing crisis. This one here is called The Great Australian Housing Nightmare or something like that. Right? This book's written in 1978. Right? So housing was a nightmare in 1978.
It's an old problem.
In 1836, Charles Darwin, the biologist, father of evolution, wrote the theory of natural selection. In 1836, he arrived in Sydney on the HMS Beagle. Population of New South Wales was 19,000 people, right? So it's only been a penal colony full of convicts for about 50 years. First day's diary entry, what does Charles Darwin say? He doesn't say, wow, kangaroos, koalas, I've solved evolution. No, he says, the number of homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house.
That is amazing. I'll have to look that up. I haven't heard that.
That's the first day's diary. It's like January 21st, 1836. He did not observe any animals. He just said the people in Sydney complain about houses. That's the first thing I'm going to write about. Amazing. So I think that's really important context. I think the bigger point on regulations and the abundance agenda and the procedure for procedure's sake and costly procedures, I think is essentially true everywhere. In large organizations, in schools, I bet there's procedures that have evolved over time that just sap people's time and don't allow them flexibility. Large organizations, government departments, you name it. And I think that's also true of the planning system. It always leaves the door open for another procedure. And, that's okay. We have to refresh that periodically. And that's why economists like competition, right? Because if you've got one company making something and they sort of become very inefficient with their internal procedures and add costs and costs and costs and costs, you want to be able to refresh that by having a new organization come in with different ways of organizing production without those procedures, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think government departments do need refreshing. Things need to be thrown out. And the lessons I've got from working in government departments, the idea that you can do this with a scalpel and just remove the wasteful parts, I think is wrong, because there are so many incentives entrenched in organizations to have things the way they are that you need to throw them all out and refresh it. Just like competition, the new company comes in and destroys the old one. And that's how you get that refresh when the existence of that company is threatened. And they may never do it. They might just go bankrupt, right? And I'll give you, what are some good examples? Like this, the relevance today is like Donald Trump, right? He's cutting this, he's cutting that. That's the only way, because everyone has an incentive to keep things how they are, feather their own nests. I just did a podcast last week with an aid industry insider who calls it the aid industrial complex, right? The whole idea of countries giving aid money to other countries to help them in a time of need has become its own industry,
Mm.
where instead of the money going, in a very efficient, direct way to what's needed for that country, there's a whole industry of middlemen who go, it's our business to get
Mm.
paid from these aid money. And the more aid is needed, the more we take a cut. So
Yeah.
we don't want to solve any problems. In fact, my first book on grey corruption, I got a random phone call from someone who said, I don't know who to talk to, but I've read your book. I work in a homelessness organization, and I don't think they want to solve homelessness. I've I've worked there, and we do all these things, and sometimes they work. Then there was a big program got announced with lots of funding, but we wouldn't be involved. It would essentially steal our job by bypassing our thing, and really helping with some big amounts of money. And the head of the organization tried to sabotage it,
Mm.
because if homelessness is solved, you don't get your cushy job as CEO of this. You don't get to go to conferences and show people how caring you are. So you actually sabotage things that work to keep you in business. So I think, as you say, there are classic cases of new high-speed rail in California or the high-speed rail in the UK, of this industry of lawyers and experts who take up a case. Oh, you've got to save this bat and this bird or whoever. And if there's money there to be had from that procedure, all those experts, all those lawyers and consultants have an interest in never building that railway line, because once it's built, who's going to pay them their
Mm.
expensive fees to count bats or do whatever, right? And so everyone ends up, in this quagmire of suing each other, or bogging each other down with extra complaints. And unfortunately, I think that's the natural state of the world. I think actually avoiding that and having a degree of capital investment in large facilities that everyone's happy with, a degree of supporting public investment as well, so private
Mm.
and public, and not getting bogged down deciding what to do and complaining about it. That's a rare thing in human history. I
Mm.
think it's a rare and precious thing. And I think economists have a role to articulate that it's good to invest in new things. And
Yeah.
procedures like this not only cost us the dollar value we paid to consultants, they inhibit the overall growth of the economy. So I think I'm totally on board with that. Also, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a straight answer because I'm an economist. I understand the history. If you look at the 1930s reviews of the slum conditions in Australian cities for housing, people couldn't keep food in their house because of the rats and rodents and
Mm.
cockroaches, right? Because there's rat infestations from the stables down the road, and everyone was keeping horses in the cities because obviously there's still a lot of horse drawn. And people would have to hang any food they had on a wire from the ceiling, hoping the rats couldn't climb down that wire that they had. It was pretty disgusting, right? In fact, it was not even until the late 1960s that most Australian homes got sewers, right? We were all
Mm.
just crapping in a bucket out the back.
Mm.
So yeah, the rules exist and require, all these high standards of housing. Well, to be honest, it's not that high.
Mm.
And unfortunately, I think what happens is rules get outdated. The materials and techniques we use to construct move on, and yet the rules are still stuck in the 1960s when we were just putting sewer pipes into homes. So
Mm.
anyway, I totally get it. I'm with you. It's never easy, and I think there's a strong role for economists to sort of help people who need to negotiate to move beyond this, to articulate
Mm.
the costs and benefits and understand the importance of economic growth and
Mm.
maintaining our investment to have a wealthy, functioning society.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Cameron. And I think I have such high value in you and people like you who, they write, they add, the complex context to try to not simplify because these are very nuanced problems, but to try to better articulate what is happening, why it's happening, what the possible impacts, and raising the questions. Because I think that might be, I mean, at least I feel like that aligns well with with one of the reasons why I love my job is the opportunity to sort of explain and articulate what's going on in a way that is not only engaging but also accurate, as opposed to the oversimplification or perhaps that kind of tends to spread across news media and things like that. Well,
Terrific.
it is 6:01. It is 6:01, so I think we do have to call it there. We've been for the full hour, so but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Cameron. It was wonderful to get to catch up and chat with you again. I'm sure the students are going to get a lot of benefit, especially with your particular insights on the housing market and all the complexities around there. Yes, and all of your writing with the one man think tank, as you say. So thank you very much on behalf of the Australian Economics Olympiad.
Thanks for having me, Justin. Thanks, everyone.
No worries. Yep. Thank you, Cameron. Okay, everybody. Just before we sign off, thank you very much for listening and watching. Just wanted to kind of remind you that our next educative seminar is going to be 2 weeks from today, the 26th of April. And this one should be a little bit more about the Economics Olympiad, since we are speaking with our guest 2 weeks from now will be Samuel Brew, who is currently an undergraduate economics and math student at UNSW. And he also happens to be one of the 2022 national winners of the Australian Economics Olympiad. So a very different lens or perspective as Cameron. And so that definitely will be of interest to a lot of you as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.